well within a mile of your house, that's a lot different than if you have 20 wells within a mile of your house. Then you have to know for any one well, out of all those wells that are near your house, what's the probability that it's going to fail? Got it? Two important questions. So let's look at the first question and ask, well, what would you expect the well density to be in a modern shale gas play like the Marcellus here in western Pennsylvania? Well, you've all seen the slides and videos of other talks. This is the cartoon put together by Chesapeake. They make it look so pretty. So here's the surface, and here's a pad, here's a pad, here's a pad, here's a pad. They don't bother telling you that this is a mile, and that's about 2 miles. I put those labels in. And obviously each pad nowadays has many wells. This particular diagram shows 6 wells coming from each of those 4 pads, so there's 24 wells here. And you all know that to economically develop shale gas, you have to not only be able to drill vertically, but you have to be able to drill directionally so that you can create laterals that expose as many natural joints in the shale as you possibly can, which is the reason why the laterals always run in opposite directions. They're always running in a direction that intersects the most natural joints, and so you go that way and that way if the joints are this way. So that one picture tells you a lot about the geology and geochemistry of shale gas development. But the most important element of that picture is 8 to 10 wells per square mile. Okay, now they'll say, but there's not 8 to 10 pads per square mile. No, but the number of pads is irrelevant. If we're asking the question, what is the probability that your water well is being contaminated? The critical issue is how many times do you poke a hole in the ground? It's the number of wells per square mile, not the number of pads per square mile. So the record in Pennsylvania that I know of right now is 19 wells on one pad. The record in North America is 51 wells on one pad. Okay? So you can say, well, the pad spacing is on a grid 1 mile by 2 miles, but you got to ask how many wells per unit area. And right now in Pennsylvania, the design objective is more or less 8 to 10 wells per square mile. That's 8 to 10 holes that human beings punched in what was the natural protective system that kept what was down here from coming up into your groundwater. We punched holes in it. 8 to 10 holes per square mile. Did I say something wrong?
Now, if you're punching holes, do water wells and geothermal wells do?
Absolutely. Any time you punch a hole, whether it's a gas well, an oil well, a water well, a geothermal well, if you're punching holes, you're punching holes in something that used to be a natural barrier. And so you have an obligation to make sure that when you punch that hole, you properly gasket it so nothing leaks around your well. Right? Okay. So, answer to the first part of the question, how many wells would you expect? Oh, 8 to 10 wells per square mile. Is that actually happening in Pennsylvania? Well, yeah. Not so much in Butler County. But come on up to Susquehanna, Bradford, Tioga, or down to Washington, and you'll see something like this. This is a map of Bradford County, one of the northeastern counties. This is the New York-Pennsylvania state line. Each color corresponds to an operator. And this was from April of this year. Every one of these more or less rectangular areas is what we call a spacing unit, or a production unit, I guess they call them here. And every black dot is the location of a pad, and on every pad there are multiple wells. So you can see the more or less 1 mile by 2 mile grid pattern, and that's your fate. I was asked earlier tonight, what's the probability that Pennsylvania is soon going to have a moratorium or a ban on continued development of this type? Sorry to have to tell you, not likely. That's your fate. And that's not complete development. That's only about, 50% coverage of the county. There are currently 6,800 shale gas wells, Marcellus and Uticas, that have been drilled in Pennsylvania. Most industry experts estimate there will be at least 100,000. So you're just beginning. All right, that's not good news. Let's start getting some insight into, well, if that's the density of wells, Do we have any insight at this point into the density of water impacts, well water impacts? And I want to take you to a relatively new website, the U.S. map project within Frac Tracker. I'm sure you're all aware of what Frac Tracker is, which is starting to assemble information countrywide on suspected water well impacts. We'll zoom in. Here's Pennsylvania. Now the blue is, where's the color here? Oh, groundwater complaints to the Pennsylvania DEP. You probably read earlier this year that a very resourceful reporter for the Scranton newspaper fought through the PA-DEP bureaucracy and had to get eventually a court decision for the PA-DEP to release copies of every letter of determination that had been sent to our fellow citizens, declaring either that their water well had been contaminated by nearby gas drilling operations, had not been contaminated, or were not sure. Okay, so all those blue dots, well, that's part of them, but there are about 1,000 families that received such letters, and of those, about 160 were told, yeah, your water well has been contaminated by nearby gas drilling. Zoom in a little closer, I think we're here, right? And you can see that you haven't been immune to this in this area. There have been determination letters sent, perhaps to some of you, by DEP saying your water well has been contaminated, and there are many others where the DEP can't be sure. That's unfortunate. So we've already seen some sort of correlation where you have high density drilling, you have high density impacts. Perhaps the most notable of these impacts, and now the longest lived one in Pennsylvania, is what I call the Dimmick debacle. So here's Carter Road, the most infamous road in all of, it used to be the Pennsylvania Turnpike. I think the most famous road in all of Pennsylvania is Carter Road. It's just a 1.5 lane dirt road through the forest. It's amazing. Dimmick is a crossroads right up here. So this red rectangle is the so-called affected area, 9 square miles, proclaimed by the PA-DEP as a really, really bad situation, starting back in 2009. Every one of those red dots is a pad. So in that 9 square miles, we can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's about 30 pads in 9 square miles. 63 wells in 9 square miles. Let's see, 9 square miles, 63, that's 7 wells per square mile. How about that? And most of those pads only have 2 or 3 wells so far. These large squares, these are the families that had their well water contaminated. By DEP declaration, there were consent orders, 3 consent orders, signed by the CEO of Cabot and John Hanger. You remember him, right? That declared, yeah, you ruined these people's well waters. So there's proximity of high density drilling to absolute evidence of contamination. Since then, various researchers have gone to Pennsylvania, come into Pennsylvania. Academics from Pennsylvania, academics from outside of Pennsylvania, and many of you are familiar with the so-called Duke studies. So colleagues of ours from Duke University began to inquire about this apparent relationship that I just showed you. You have a lot of wells, and you have a lot of alleged contamination incidents. And of course, the industry is the first to proclaim that it wasn't them. Well, was it?
Yes.
So this is a graph out of the first paper by Duke. Told you there were going to be graphs. Horizontal axis is distance between a particular water well, which was tested, and the nearest gas well. Distance between water well and gas well, from 0 to 6,000 meters. Vertical axis is concentration of methane in the water well that's being tested. So they went to 100 or so water wells initially, measured the methane concentration, and then just measured the distance between the water well and the nearest gas well. And what they found was a very strong correlation. The closer the water well is to the gas well, the higher the concentration of methane. It's a correlation. The difference between correlation and causation. You can't specifically say from that information That's data and information. You can't specifically say that that water well was contaminated by a gas well that was 1,000 feet away. You can't say it. You can just say there's a correlation. More science needs to be done, and is being done. So in this first paper, the people who wrote it, who are not gas and oil engineers, they're not petroleum engineers, they're not geologists, they're groundwater hydrologists and chemists, they were scratching their head. Well, how, if that methane is coming from a gas well into these water wells, how's it getting there? Where's it coming from? And so they just offered conjectures. So this is a quote from the paper. There are at least 3 possible mechanisms for fluid migration into the drinking water reservoir aquifers, blah, 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 blah. A second mechanism is leaky gas well casings. Well, they sort of got that right. This is the first time the colleagues of mine incorrectly intuned in the public literature the wrong word. Everybody know the difference between a casing and a cement job? There are 3 parts to the structure of a gas well or an oil well or a water well. There's the hole you drill in the ground. That's necessary. There's casing, which is steel pipe. And then there's cement, which is gasketing material. So they didn't know the difference. They just said casings. And then they went off a year later and did another survey. And they went to another couple hundred of wells, and they found the same correlation. And of course, they have been criticized loudly, long by many, including some in the academy from certain universities in Pennsylvania, saying, well, you're measuring methane, but it's biogenic methane, and it's not necessarily from shale if it's not biogenic, and if it is from shale, not biogenic, it's certainly not Marcellus. Excuses, excuses, excuses. And so this time they also measured the ethane concentration and the propane concentration. And again, they found a strong correlation. Well, you can't get ethane or propane out of biogenic gas. Chemistry doesn't work that way. So they proved that whatever gas was getting into these wells was thermogenic. But they still hadn't attempted to show a causation. If this gas well is leaking, can the gas leaking from that well get into this water well, and can we prove it? All right. So that's about 2 years ago, and I got really interested in this problem. For those of you who don't know, and Wanda didn't tell you something about me. She didn't tell you a lot of things about me, thank God. Thank you, Wanda. So I'm not just a civil engineer. My PhD is in an arcane area called rock fracture mechanics. There were about 9 of us on the face of the earth. It's not an exaggeration, actually. Not many people got PhDs in rock fracture mechanics back in the 70s. And I spent about 25 years working as a consultant for and a researcher for the oil and gas industry. So I understand the industry, I understand the technology, I understand the jargon, I understand the equipment, I understand the personnel, I understand the science. And so when I got really interested in this correlation, and the fact that I was coming down to Pennsylvania, constantly meeting families whose water wells had the same things. The water was fine, and then one morning it got brown or black. It started to smell, and they couldn't soap with it anymore. Soap, S-O-A-P, couldn't lather with it anymore. Wow, that's interesting. So I and a couple of colleagues, I mentioned them on the first slide, decided to do an in-depth study of this problem. And when scientists and engineers decide to do research, the first thing they do is stand on the shoulders of giants. You find out who has already studied this problem and what can we learn from them. Well, in this case, we wound up standing on the shoulders of midgets. Which didn't give us much headroom. I'm sorry that's insulting to somebody in the oil and gas industry, but in certain cases they deserve it. In other cases, no. I'm going to show you data. First thing you do is you go out and you read the literature on the topic. What do we already know about the question? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to redo research that somebody else has already done well. So I'm going to show you a set of slides which sample what the industry knows and has known about how often wells leak. So earlier this year, I was invited to participate in a webinar sponsored by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, of which I'm a member. And on this webinar, Mr. Paul Hopman, well-known petroleum geologist, gave a seminar. The webinar was on wellbore integrity. There's another one of those phrases, wellbore integrity. That's an acronym for whether the well structure, the hole you drill in the ground, the casing and the cement, are all performing as designed. If not, the well has lost its integrity. So, this is a slide from his talk. This was scary enough. Industry will drill more wells in the next decade that have been drilled in the last 100 years, and they drilled about 7 million so far. 4.2 million in North America alone. And then he sampled part of the global well population, for which he had data, and found that 35% of the wells he sampled, 35% of 1.8 million, were leaking. How do I know that? Well, sustained casing pressure is another one of these acronyms, so let me run through them. Loss of zonal isolation, loss of wellbore integrity, sustained casing pressure, sustained casing vent flow, sustained annular flow. They're all the same thing. The well's leaking. Okay? Leaking equals all those things. So sustained casing pressure means the well is leaking, and in one or more of the annuli between one or more of the various layers of casing, which are steel pipe, where they're supposed to be gasketing the material, either they're